Welcome to what's going to be sort of a sword review and sort of a side-by-side comparison. If you've been following my channel, I recently did yet another update on my highly modified old Cold Steel 1796, which is still evolving. I'm not quite done making changes, but I've done a lot to it. Refer to those previous videos. And in that video, we talked about the newer Windlass version of this sword, which was apparently influenced by the always awesome Matt Easton. And that one has gotten a lot of great reviews with a few caveats that we'll talk about. But coming up on the holidays, Museum Replicas, which is my in-country Windlass outlet, had an awesome Black Friday sale. So I figured I deserved a couple of treats, picked up a couple of 3 pieces. And when it came down to finally pushing the add to cart button, it was between another sword I really had my eye on and, yes, their 1796. And because I was curious about this, and a lot of you were in the comments, I decided to pick this one over the other one. And spoiler alert, I kind of regret it. Let's go ahead and start talking about my regrets, where we usually start with the Scabbard. And I'm going to have to check the time index of the video to see when I can start using obscenities to not get demonetized. But externally speaking, I feel like they did a good job at recreating an authentic one. It's a one-piece steel scabbard. The hangers are welded on. The shape is integral. The only removable part is the throat insert, and that came in handy. We'll talk about that in just a second. But because the blade is so broad, that's 2 inches 5 centimeters front to back. And they did make the spine side, interestingly enough, it's flat, which I've seen on historic examples, so I think they got that right. But this is a big, chunky piece of steel. By itself, it weighs 1 pound 15 ounces, 878 grams, which is exactly the same weight the sword is. But where it really fell apart for me was in the innards. They went cheap. And I read other reviews that said very similar things. I know I'm not alone in this. For liners, they went with their really cheap, thin, white plastic polypropylene strips, which are adhered to the inside of the scabbard by a couple of little squares of sticky foam, the kind of stuff you hang posters with. They are notorious for wearing out and not staying put. But in this case, yeah, first time he inserted the sword, it got stuck halfway in. And what I found was both of the liners were just sitting in there loose. The sharp blade grabbed them, cut them to pieces, and without any resistance whatsoever, rammed them more than halfway down into the scabbard. So pulled off that throat insert, reached down there with a couple of long tools, managed to get bits out, but the majority of one of those liners was rammed way down in there. So it was a choice between going through the hassle and potential expense of sending it back to Museum Replicas or taking it upon myself to drill out the shape. So now it has a drainage hole. We're going to call that a bug or a feature. And use a rod to ram the stuck liner back out the front end. And what I discovered, okay, well, here are the bits. But when I looked at the sticky foam squares, so the first thing I noticed was they're only at the bottom end. There was really nothing securing them at the top. But worse, in my example, whoever inserted these into the scabbard did not bother to pull the backing off the sticky foam. So it wasn't stuck to anything. Motherfucker! Okay, breathe, Mike. Moving on. What I'm left with is a blade sitting in a big old hollow and heavy steel tube. Yeah, that's really awful to even pick up. So I might go ahead and put some, well, at least partial leather liners in here. I just don't know if it's worth it to me to do so yet. And this is also where I have to admit that this, well, pretty much initial experience I had with the sword may have indeed negatively biased me to, well, everything else. So after my little therapeutic outburst, I'm going to try to proceed objectively. Close-up mode to talk about the friendly ends, and yes, there is more frustration, at least for me here, but also we'll talk about there's a ray of hope as well. So comparing it to the cold steel, overall shape dimensions very, very similar. One of the things you might notice is the ears that come off the back strap. They are bigger on the windlass and also lower down on the grip, and we'll talk about that does make a bit of a difference in its handling feel as well. You might also argue that the grip of the windlass is a bit stouter at the top in the leather part. But the biggest difference is construction. It is a peen construction. That's a pretty messy peen though, as compared to the, it's got the end nut on there on the cold steel, which is not historic whatsoever. But yeah, not very well done. Now, the tang is also secured by a pin that goes through the ears of the back strap. The dimensions on the inside of the guard, well, it's the same as the cold steel. It is a pattern sword after all, so you've got a pretty generous 4 inches, 10 centimeters in here. This is a sword that is probably made to be exclusively handshake gripped, and we will talk about that in martial handling. But problem I had goes back to the cold steel version. This really substantial, really slick back strap makes the sword very slippy in hand. If I do, for instance, the twist test, and no, it's not sharpened down here, so this is reasonably safe. Yeah, that doesn't stay put at all. Really sloppy, and no gloves make it much worse. When I'm wearing gloves with this thing, it literally feels like it's flying out of my hand, like I have no grip over it, no control over it whatsoever. So, as we're going to talk about the dynamics of the blade being a bit more blade forward, that's not a great combination for me. So that's making me dislike the sword, but ray of hope. And that ray of hope came from looking at historic examples where not only, well, obviously over the years they developed quite a lot of corrosion, patina to different degrees, but also it didn't really look like they were ever originally made with a backstrap this mirror slick. I mean, this feels like it's lubed in my hand, and well, that's an issue right there. So that inspired me to go ahead and do an experiment with the cold steel that I had a similar issue with by using different combinations of acids alternating with bluing for patina to give this texture just a little bit more, shall we say, porousness, grippiness. And even doing that just a little bit has improved the feel of the sword, my control over it substantially. Absolutely going to talk about that in handling, but let me go ahead and do the quick twist test. Yeah, this one's not going anywhere now with that one change. So yeah, after I finish the rest of the review, I'm probably going to wind up doing that to this one and see if it makes a difference. Unfortunately, the slippy grip compounded some issues I had with the business end. And yeah, I'm going to make some comparisons to my highly modified cold steel. You saw the video I did on this. I brought the distal taper down and the weight down to the point where the sword weighs 1 pound 15 ounces, 878 grams, the point of balance, 6 inches into the blade, about 15 centimeters, which for me and a Saber, yeah, it's a perfect combination. A whole lot better than how it came to me out of the box. But I expected, given the reviews and the specs of the Windlass, that out of the box it would be even better than that. And, well, all right. First of all, what did I pay for it? I'm going currently for around $370 US at Museum Replicas, and for that I'm getting a 1080 carbon steel blade. that my test files are saying is somewhere in the low 50s, probably around 52 HRC, which is great for a through-hardened monosteel sword blade. And yes, it did come sharpened from the factory, nearly 3/4 of the length down the blade to the fort, and the false edge is sharpened. Yeah, that thing goes nearly 1/3 of the way down the back edge. So that's great. Now you can also see that the fuller does take up, well, a lot of the blade plane, and the lines aren't great. They are kind of muddy and a little bit lumpy, wavy, but not nearly as bad as the cold steel was when it came to me. But it is a more curved and broader than the cold steel and a bit longer. So looking down at my notes, they give you the metric as well as the imperial. 32.5 inches long, 82.5 centimeters. Width of the blade, an impressive 1.58 inches, 4.2 centimeters, and we talked about how that made for a really wide scabbard as well. But, okay, distal taper and point of balance. Now, Matt Easton published an article, I'll see if I can find it and put a link in the description, where he gave the stats on a spread of historic models. And I figured that's what they were going for here, but I'm going to say they kind of went for an outlier in the batch, whereas my cold steel, where I've got it now, is kind of right in the middle of that batch specs-wise. Starts out at the base at a very impressive 8mm stick, but very, very quickly thins out. By the time you get past the fort, it's down under 3mm thick, and then thins out at the ogive of the tip. That's 1.5 millimeters. So a very thin blade, which, yes, other reviewers have pointed out, makes it really flexible. And we'll see how that affects it in the performance tests. But I'm going to say that reminds me a lot of some of the cheap, thin spring steel Chinese sabers we used to practice with in class all the way back in the early 80s. So, yeah, some flashback going on here. But you would expect that would improve point of balance. All right, weight of this sword, 1 pound 15 ounces, exactly the same weight as where I've got the cold steel right now, 878 grams. That is heavier than what it said it would be on the website. Website said it would be 1 pound 12. I was expecting a lighter sword with a better point of balance. With all that distal taper, I expected it would be much closer to the hand. Maybe better than my 6-inch sweet spot, but no. 7 3/4 inches, 19 centimeters. So if you're looking for something that is very blade forward and choppy for a cavalry saber, that's great. But for me, especially combined with that super slippy grip, well, let's talk about that after I roll the test footage and we talk about handling. All right, for the edge, let's go ahead and do the cardboard test if I can keep a good grip on the thing. Yeah, that's pretty slicey. Just for comparison, my cold steel. Pretty similar. This sword is continuing to frustrate me, but let's get the test results out of the way. And I did feel the need to cut those tests short for a couple of different reasons. But starting with thrusting and stabbing into my Pell, which is multiple layers of thick cardboard backed up by a couple of inches of compressed brown paper bag paper up against my redwood target, and then to test the tip's durability into a harder media, straight into the redwood. What am I looking for? In the softer media, penetration and channel. Now, I'm definitely going to agree that this hatchet point geometry is not designed for penetration, and it hit that softer media like a shovel. A lot of impact, very little penetration. But you have to consider that Saber curricula of the era did include thrusting and stabbing with these weapons, so that should be a tool you have on the table. Into the wood, even though that's a very slim stock at the tip, no, it did not roll or bend at all, but yeah, it didn't penetrate into the wood much either. But the second thing I'm looking at, I'm specifically doing it with my edge horizontal to the camera so you can see it flex. So I'm basically thrusting in second and cot. I really wasn't prepared for how much this thing folded. I have 70 plus swords in my current collection, including a number of rapiers and, yes, small swords, and I do not have another sword that flexed this much in the test. It scared me. And on closer examination and further measurement, I realized, well, there's a QC issue going on here. The blade is not, well, very evenly ground. That's not unusual for Windlass, but okay, let me see if you can see it. About right here. Watch that spot. Yeah, there is an extreme flex right there, and that's because right there the spine thins out, well, a little bit more, an extra ½ millimeter down to about 2 millimeters before it widens back out again, before it gets slim again when you get to about, well, the end of the false edge. And yeah, it was basically folding right there, and that made me really nervous, so no, I'm not going to do that kind of testing with this blade anymore. But the third thing I'm looking at is how does it translate linear impact back into my hand? Does my hand collide with anything uncomfortable? No, but yeah, slippy grip. I didn't feel like my grip was staying put, secure, like I had good control over the weapon. And that came back to haunt me over and over and over again. Moving on to the bamboo test. Can I induce chip or roll and fragile edge? It's a very keen edge, but I wasn't really nervous about it because of the steel and the hardness and my previous experience with swords like this. So no, it didn't take any damage, and it bit impressively into that hard media. Now, I'm not trying to hack through the thing. I'm hitting it with about the pressure and rhythm I would use when I'm fencing, which also gives me a sense of how the sword will respond when I am, well, colliding, bouncing off stuff, being able to use that resistance to move the sword around. And yeah, it was really frustratingly sluggish and slow for me. Some of that is because the blade, yeah, it's definitely balanced forward more so than I expected, but I've worked with other swords that are very blade forward. A lot of it was my lack of security with the grip. I felt like I was losing control of the thing, almost like I had it connected to myself by a lanyard. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the handling section. But that also, of course, affected the cutting tests. Now, because a lot of people have had really successful experiences cutting with this blade, I started with much thicker panels than normal. And okay, I did short stroke 1 or 2, getting used to the length and curvature of it, which actually in one situation gave me a very nice, even tip cut. The vise isn't secured to the stand, so I'm basically getting the same kind of results I would get if I was cutting water bottles. Does the bottle stay put on the stand, or does it get knocked over with, you know, a little bit sloppy or impact? And I was getting a lot of my targets knocked off the stand. With the wider ones, what I was experiencing was it would get a significant distance through that panel, but then throw it off the stand, and when I picked the panel up, what I'd notice was I'd get, well, a little bit of scoop in my cut to a certain point, and then it would stop dead and roll completely. I can feel that happening in my hand as well. Now, with thinner panels, also cutting at angles versus horizontally, I was getting better results, but occasionally, yeah, it would twist, it would scoop, it would grab that target, it would throw it off the stand. Now, I didn't get a chance to do too much. I did about half an hour in the gap between the reins, and maybe I will try to improve the edge and some other things and try it again. But comparing it to, again, all of my other swords, you guys are certainly going to say, you don't know how to cut with this thing. And, all right, we are definitely about to do a comparison between this supposedly much more historically authentic version and the cold steel which I've had much better results with, even though most people have described it as being, well, spec-wise, very ahistoric. After that initial round of testing, before I got any further into my review, I went back and rewatched, well, a bunch of other reviews on this sword, including Matt Easton's original, where he talked about his process with Windlass, including sending them a historic example to copy, going through prototypes, and how he was absolutely glowing about the final result, that someone had finally, specs-wise, made a historically accurate reproduction of this sword pattern. And I have boundless respect for this man. I cannot express enough my gratitude for what he has done for the sword community. Matt, you are awesome, and you will continue to be. And most of the other reviews also very glowing. How well it was made, how well it handled, how well it cut. So I had very high expectations going in, that weren't quite fulfilled. But those reviewers also had some caveats. Now, I'm not going to argue that this is within historical specifications and build. That also, yes, definitely includes the Scabbard. Though I don't think the historic examples had cheap plastic liners. I don't think they had those back in 1796. And yes, a lot of reviewers did complain about that. So that's something I feel needs to be addressed. Now, some reviewers did express that they felt the sword might be just a bit too floppy, a bit too flexible, and they did mention that the blade finish is not completely even. And yes, that the specifications of what they received versus what was advertised didn't match up. So that may just be pervasive quality control issues with a Windlass that definitely showed up in mine. It is heavier than I expected, balanced further forward than I expected, and I'm definitely a little bit nervous of that extra thinness right there. They also talked about how their hilts weren't necessarily put together quite straight. Now, I talked about the sloppy peen, but the more I have handled this and the more I look at it, the more I notice, yes, certain pieces of the hilt aren't on straight. And how much does that affect my handling? Well, I do have to say, I think the biggest one is the curse of a lot of modern reproductions. When they do the final machine finishing, I think they over-polish some things cosmetically speaking. Now, I can't go back in time and see what an original 1796 looked like when it was new versus having all of these years of age and use on it, but I'm going to guess that they weren't machine mirror polished like this. And that, I think, is causing my primary issues with it. So let's talk about that. So let's put the sword through the lens of my usual sword evaluation criteria, starting with specs. Does it fit me? Okay, we talked about how it's heavier and more blade forward than I expected, and we'll get back to that. But then, second criteria, which is actually two criteria, is it battle ready? First part of that is, will it cut? I expect it will cut really well if I could keep a grip on it. We'll get back to that. Is it durable? Can I hit stuff with it? Well, I have no concern with basically from here down holding together. It does have a reasonably substantial fort, and the grip is held up to the impact that I put it to so far just fine. But, okay, having a really, really thin foible, I worry that if I hit something hard with it, accidentally or on purpose, it would do catastrophic damage to the blade, and that unevenness in the grind, that extra thin spot right there, yeah, that really does scare me. Now, so far, even under extreme flex, it has not taken a set yet. But the next set of criteria, martial, which I divide into three sections: offensive capability, defensive capability, and handling. Does it move, respond for me so I feel like I could, well, react to an unpredictable opponent? That's where it's falling apart for me. And it's not that it is too blade forward. I've learned how to work with that. You guys are all probably typing in the comments, Mike, you just don't know how to use this sword. Well, like I said, I have 70-something swords, all different kinds. But I have struggled with this design before. And here's my proof. The Cold Steel 1796 again, considered to be a bad reproduction spec-wise, too heavy, too thick in the blade. If you watch previous reviews, you know I did a lot of thinning of this out to get it within historic spec for weight balance and, yes, distal taper. But even though that vastly improved the handling, I was still struggling with that machine polish slick back strap. I couldn't keep a good grip on it for control in cutting or handling. But making that one minor little change, a little bit of acid etch to take off the mirror polish, and then I'll put some patina on it for appearance, suddenly this is an entirely different weapon for me. Feels really secure in my hand, which also makes it really responsive. And just again, with that one small change, this has suddenly become one of my favorite swords. Not just sabers, but swords in general. So I went from not fitting with this pattern to really clicking with it. One small change. Now, good science, you need to repeat your results. So, proof number 2. You saw the review I did on the Thompson. Now, it's got a grippier grip because of the fake ray skin, but still has a slick back strap. A little bit of checkering up here at the top doesn't do much. So, repeated the experiment. Acid etched off the mirror polish down to a satin, reblued it, one little change. Yeah, this sword is now much grippier, which means also much more responsive in my hand. And this is a more blade-forward sword. Having more grip gives me more control, so it doesn't feel so blade heavy. What's happening with the Windlass? Offense, defense, and maneuverability. When I cut with the thing, I feel like I'm going to lose control over it. Not only is it twisting in my hand, but it feels like it's going to fly out of my hand that way. And it's much worse with gloves on. I almost feel like I'm swinging it from a string or a sword knot or something like that. And that might be a feature for a cavalry officer. Let me know in the comments. But, if you're hitting something at horse speed and having it knock the sword out of your hand and being able to use the knot to recover it, I'd be really worried about not only my horse, but my own leg if that happened. So, yeah, that doesn't inspire any confidence whatsoever. And that comes up again in defense. If this was to take a hit, or I was to do any beating or bearing, pressing, I feel like I could twist the sword out of my own hand, or my opponent could knock it out of my hand. And when it comes to maneuverability and response, being able to feint or change direction, yeah, the thing feels like it's lubed in my grip, which is made worse because it is a blade forward. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the review right here, do the thing, and see if I can repeat the magic. While I'm waiting for the magic to happen, I figured I'd answer a couple of questions real quick, starting with one I get frequently. What do I use to do the etching with? And the answer is nothing industrial. I'm not trying to dissolve a significant amount of metal, just alter the finish. So you could probably use something you might have around the house right now, including phosphoric acid-based rust and scale removers, or vinegar, or lemon juice. And yes, I've tried blends of those, or ketchup, or good old-fashioned yellow mustard. And the more I've done this experiment, the more I've come to appreciate that yellow mustard. It's what I'm using this time, because I can slather it on nice and thick and leave it for a couple of hours. I'll make sure there's no oil on the metal by wiping it down with some alcohol or acetone. Might roughen up the finish a little bit with some mild sandpaper. Layer it on thick, leave it sit. Now, I would absolutely recommend you leave the sword outside or in some well-ventilated area, because let me tell you, rusty mustard smells really bad. But after it's done its thing for a few hours, you wash it off. It often leaves kind of a matte gray finish, which you can improve with steel wool, 3M pads, or what I like to do is give it a patina with some sort of cold blue solution. And we'll see how this one turned out. Now, the second question is, are there any other fixes to this problem? And my good friend Adam Novath, I'll put the link to his channel in the description if you haven't checked him out yet. He does awesome custom work on swords and other edge weapons. He's much better at it than I am. Definitely give his channel a look. But he suggested a historic fix. Apparently, in extreme climates, officers and troopers would wrap their grips. Why? Well, think about it for a second. If you're in a really hot climate with the sun beating down on that steel,
and you reach down for it with a bare hand, yeah, that could not only be painful, but injurious. I used to live in a really hot climate, so I know exactly what that's like. But now that I live in a cold climate, I can see the other thing happening. I'm out in freezing weather and happen to reach down for that steel with a bare hand. Yeah, that could be not very fun either. Will I wrap the grip? Will I need to wrap the grip? Well, first we'll see how the mustard fix works in my relative time. I've still got a couple of hours to wait, and then we'll find out.
Science! So I put up a series of photos so you can see the stages of the process, but I left that mustard on there for a good 4 hours. Turns out this was kind of a hard metal to corrode. Scrubbed it off, applied a coat of, in this case, Birchwood Casey Perma Blue, which is something I use if I don't want a really deep dark finish. In other words, most of it rubs off after the first application with some steel wool. So if I don't want a dark finish, I just want kind of a patina, I'll go with that. And what I'm left with in this case is sort of a light gunmetal finish. Now I only did the back strap. I don't think it's too much of a glaring contrast with the rest of the fixtures, but I may go ahead and treat those as well to make it blend in aesthetically. But what's most important here is taking off the mirror polish down to a satin finish has, yes indeed, significantly improved my grip on the weapon, and because of that I'm starting to appreciate this sword a lot more. Now this is where I also have to say this may just be me and my weird skin. I have notoriously dry hands, very little hand oil, which is why I can get away with putting my fingers all over carbon steel and not corroding it. You may have entirely different experiences with these slick back straps. Let me know in the comments. But for me now, at least martially speaking, I feel like I can make really good use of this sword within certain limitations. Offensively speaking, okay. The geometry of the tip and that extra flexibility, especially with that thinned out spot right there in the middle that sort of makes it fold in half and scares me. I think any thrusting is off the table, but cutting. Okay, it is still blade forward. If I wanted to improve the balance, I feel like I would need to take that extra 3 ounces off the business end, but since this is so thin, I have no idea where I could safely remove that much steel. Probably not going to do it. So I'm basically just going to have to accept that this is a Cavalry Saber and use it as such. No fancy fencing, cross training. I feel like though I've got a good enough grip control over it to do big hewing cuts and slashes, and I think the edge and the geometry would be fantastic at that. Have not had a chance to take it back out and do more test cutting. Also, I have a good functional back edge for, yes, back cutting, referred to Hutton and other sources. Defensively speaking, nothing fancy, but I feel like, well, got a secure enough grip that I could at least effectively manage the 5 or 6 most common parries that you tend to see in British Saber curricula. And I think that's where this sword is going to fit into my training regimen, to keep me to the fundamentals. Nothing fancy. If I want to go with the fancy fencing techniques and the cross training and the other things, yes, I'm going to go with, well, at this point I'm going to call this one mine, which, yes, I have to admit, I still like better all around. But yeah, definitely learning to appreciate this now for what it is, with its flaws and limitations. But liking it enough that I'm going to go ahead and put the time into the scabbard. Figure out how to put either a leather or a wood liner in there so it's not just a big old hollow metal tube. Alright, all that said, let's get our conversation going in the comments. I am still curious about the LK Chen, but budget-wise that's going to be way down the road, so stay tuned. If you have any questions about this sword, you have this sword, you have the cold steel, you have any other replicas, you have any originals, you have the LK Chen, tell me about those. Any other sword recommendations you'd like to make, keep those coming. As always, thank you all so much for watching. following my journey, especially today, putting up with my madness, liking, subscribing, and I hope to see you back for, okay, I'm going to balance the knife and the sword reviews and eventually, yes, get to those hatchets and hawks. But the next sword up for review is, well, a newer Windlass, and that would be the St. Michael.